Hey, how's it going? Hope you're good. So I'm going to show you how you can shoot video like you've just seen with the Insta360 X3 in difficult lighting conditions like at nighttime if there's only artificial light around. Shots just like these, which are traditionally quite difficult for 360 cameras to do. There are some specific settings and shooting techniques that you really need to know about so you can get the most out of the camera in these situations. And thankfully, the Insta360 X3 is actually one of the better options for a 360 camera if you want to shoot at nighttime at low light, because it features two 1/2-inch sensors that allows it to capture more light, so it's more likely to do well in these environments. But it's mostly to do with how you set up the camera. The difference between setting up the camera manually for low light video and just allowing it to do it itself is astonishing. So let's take a look at how to set up your Insta360 X3 to shoot low light video, as well as some general tips and tricks for keeping your video sharp, smooth, and crisp. So like most cameras, the Insta360 X3 features both an automatic and a manual mode. When you turn the camera on or use it for the first time, it will usually default to the automatic setting. Now, this is fine if you're shooting in daylight, in good lighting conditions, when it's sunny or overcast. Basically, if there's plenty of light around, the camera should be able to handle that absolutely fine on its own. The difficulty comes when shooting at nighttime. Even if there is a lot of artificial light around, the massive difference between the bright lights of, say, in a city and the darkness of everything else, the fact that it's nighttime, the camera's really going to struggle to work out what settings it needs. In automatic mode, the video will be overexposed, probably be quite grainy, you'll notice this fuzziness, and it just won't look that good. But if you select the right settings in a manual mode, you can really improve the quality of your videos, even in really difficult lighting conditions. Now, just to say that this is not perfect, there is a limitation to what 360 cameras, or really all action cameras, can do in these situations. This is not a DSLR, it's not going to be able to shoot crystal clear, super high quality video in low light, but there are some simple things you can do to improve the quality overall. So let's go through the settings that we're going to change, what they mean, and what happens when you change them. Let's start with ISO. ISO refers to the camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the value, the more sensitive to light and therefore brighter your video will be. The value usually begins at around 100 and goes all the way up to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 depending on what camera you have. However, you should always try and keep the ISO as low as possible, because a lower ISO will result in less grainy video. Higher ISO will result in that fuzziness you get. The reason the automatic mode is usually quite grainy and fuzzy is because the camera puts the ISO really, really high, so we're trying to get it as low as possible. Shutter speed refers to how long the camera shutter is open and is presented in fractions of a second. Shooting at a shutter speed of 100 is displayed as 1/100th of a second, so this means the shutter will be open for 1/100th of a second per frame. Shutter speed affects both the brightness of your video and how smooth and crisp moving objects appear in your video. And finally, white balance. Now, this refers to the color of your video, whether it appears more yellow, blue, or somewhere in the middle as neutral. A lower value will make the hue of your video more blue, and a higher value will make it appear more yellow. So let's get into the settings. We're going to go through the best settings for still video, as if the camera was mounted on a tripod or a monopod and not moving at all. And I'm going to go through the best settings for moving video, so if you happen to be moving with the camera. So the goal is to keep the dark areas dark and the light areas crisp, colorful, and properly exposed. The actual settings you use will depend on how much light is available, but these settings are a great starting point. Firstly, regardless of what kind of video you're shooting, you're going to want to set the resolution to the maximum possible 5.7K. So let's start looking at some still low light video. On the Insta360 X3 screen, swipe from the right and you'll see the option to go into manual mode. Tap on that and you'll see the options at the bottom. You have ISO, shutter speed, and white balance. In this situation where the camera is still, set the shutter speed to 50. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, and a general rule of video, particularly if it's not moving, if it's still, that you should set the shutter speed to twice the frame rate. If you were shooting at 30 frames per second, then you would go to 60. So this is a fairly low shutter speed and it allows your camera to take in more light per frame. And thanks to the lower shutter speed, you will be able to set the ISO to a fairly low setting. In most cases, between 200, 320 or 400 would be ideal. A lower ISO setting will result in less noise and overall clearer video. Now, if you're shooting still video in an extreme low light environment where there's not much artificial light, then you would still keep the shutter speed setting to 50, but increase the ISO to 400, 500 or 600, and just take a look and see if that's light enough. The resulting video would be a little bit more grainy, but should still be usable. Now, let's talk about shooting moving video in these low light situations, which is a little bit more difficult. When moving with the camera, you want to ensure that any lights captured in your video aren't shaky or blurred, which is almost certain to happen when shooting in auto mode. I see this in a lot of videos where people go out and shoot Christmas lights or neon lights or in a big city, and every time the shooter takes a step or moves the camera a little bit quickly, the lights kind of go a bit fuzzy and you can kind of tell when they take a step, and it kind of just ruins the shot. But there are ways to minimize this or even get rid of that altogether. For moving video, the absolute most important thing is to set the shutter speed to a higher value. You're going to want to set the shutter speed up to at least 100 or maybe 200ths of a second. Somewhere between those two values is probably going to be good enough. But now remember, the higher the value, the shutter speed, the darker your video will appear because it has less time to take in the light. Now, this means for the video to be usable, you're going to need to set the ISO higher. If the shutter speed is at 1/100th of a second, then the ISO should probably be at least 500 or 600. Again, this will make your video a little bit grainy, but with the X3, thanks to the larger sensors, it can handle those higher ISO settings before getting too grainy. The higher shutter speed kind of gets rid of that shakiness in the lights and just makes your video look a lot more attractive. Now, the rules for white balance, which I mentioned before, basically apply whether your camera is still or moving. It's preferable to set a continuous white balance. This means selecting one of the values in the camera rather than allowing it to change continuously. The choice of white balance will depend on the effect you're trying to achieve. A general rule I go by is if most of the available light is white, then a lower white balance is preferable between 2400 and 3000. That should give it a kind of bluish tinge, which I think works well with blue lights, gives it a kind of wintry effect. For colorful lights, you should set a more neutral white balance of around 3800 to 4000, which keeps the colors looking as they should in reality. To achieve a warmer effect, if the lights are already yellow, select a higher value up to around 5000. So those are some settings to start off with. I've showed you plenty of examples there. If you want to copy those settings, then just go back and screenshot. I put the values in there, so that would be an easy way to copy my settings and you can see if they work for you. But there are also some general tips and tricks for when you're shooting to make sure your low light video looks as good as possible. The first is to use a tripod or a monopod with a thick base with something you can grip onto. For example, something like this. With this, it has 3 legs, it has a nice wide base, and it allows you to really grip onto the camera. This type of tripod or monopod will absorb the vibrations that you make when you move and reduce the likelihood of shaky video. And the second tip is to use your body as a type of vibration dampener. By tightening your core muscles and tightening the muscles in your arm and kind of trying to glide as you walk instead of stomping with your feet, you will massively reduce the amount of vibrations and shakiness and allow your camera to capture those lights without any shakiness. And you could even reduce the ISO settings and the shutter speed, which will allow you to shoot clearer video. So that's it, guys. I hope you found that useful. Those are my settings for shooting low light video with the Insta360 X3. I think it does a decent job. Certainly better than the last version. Those half-inch sensors making a fairly significant difference when shooting in low light. The footage that I shot, I'm pretty pleased with. You can let me know what you think in the comments below, or if you have any tips and tricks yourself. There'll be more videos coming of how to shoot with this camera and some other ones and some more comparisons if you're wondering what to buy in the lead up to Christmas. So yeah, stay tuned, subscribe for that. I'll see you next time. Bye.